My testimony is about how God uses the weak and foolish things of this world to confound the wise. In 1995, around about 1995, I was in a church in Leeds. I won't tell you the name of the church. And we were seeking the Lord for a word for this nation because nothing was happening. There was nothing happening much around the place. And we met together every single night for a period of 3 months. Prior to this, some of our ladies had gone out to Ethiopia and the Lord had spoken to them out there, and they came back and the church got to pray. Then we had a short time when there was no prayer in the meeting. I'm talking about a big church here at this time. And then 6 months later we came and we prayed for a whole year and sought the Lord as a church as to what God wanted us to do. And it culminated in a night of prophecy where the pastor did the prophesying and the people in the congregation brought words and interpreted words that were given. At this time, God spoke to me personally, and he said to me something which today I can see the poignancy of it, but at that time I didn't know what. He said to me, if I strike the shepherd and the sheep are scattered, what will you do with my word? And that at that time was quite a challenge to me because I had not been a public speaker. I hadn't gone out and shared my testimony. I had been very tied up because I was an unmarried mother at 16. I'd had a lot of condemnation. I was brought up in the Catholic Church. And it took me 17 years to get over the condemnation that I had through the situation that I've been in. And God set me free one day miraculously, but that's aside the way. So I'd never gone out, I'd never shared a testimony or anything. And God spoke in that meeting and he gave us 3 directives. He said, go and tell the country to repent and turn back to righteousness. Tell the church it's lost contact with God. And the third thing was, don't take any captives, don't take any prisoners. And then the God told us to go to a table and take what we wanted for this mission. So we all went out and we all took these things. And then as a church, gradually people went out. Now this church was 300 people. Okay, it was at least 300 people. And after I didn't go out initially. My daughter went out with the team before me, and there was another pastor in the church that went out, and they preached in different countries. We started in Bradford, actually, funnily enough. And as soon as we started to go out after all this time of prayer, which was intense. Oh, and by the way, in that time, God has told us to get rid of our television sets, get rid of anything that would distract us from hearing his word. He told us to keep our minds focused on him. And that's what all the focus of the meetings were. There was no pews, there was nothing in the church. Everything was taken away. We just sought the Lord and we prayed and we prayed. When we went out for the first time, all hell broke loose. People started to get arrested. My daughter went out with a team in Darley Street. And she got taken to the cells in Darley Street. And in fact, my husband was telephoned to ask if she was sane, whether she had a mental illness or not. And my husband testified to the person that was phoning her that she had more sanity than he did. So that was that. And then, as I said, we went out in groups. And I went out after about 3 months. And what happened was, we were told not to take any publicity. We were told to go into the town, to preach the word and leave. That was our directive. Now, when God gives you a directive, don't take on anything else. You take on what God says. Now, we're all different. My ministry is very different to Kevin's ministry. But that's what God said to us. He said, go out, preach the word, and then leave. Now, he didn't mean if somebody came rushing up to you and wanted to be saved that he walked away. He meant, he meant on the whole, don't wait for anything to happen. After you've gone out in your groups, leave. And so we weren't meant to be evangelists at that time. We were meant to be heralds, heralding the way, if you like, and preaching the gospel. And at that time, all sorts of things happened. As soon as we started to get arrested for preaching the gospel, the church went down in numbers, and then went down and down and down in numbers. And of the 300 people that preached, that stood and that were in the church at the beginning, by the end, there was just a handful of people left. Because as soon as persecution came, God is really, it's not always the people that start that are the called ones. But sometimes it's the people that are left become the called ones, because the called ones drift away. And so you have to keep going with whatever God says to you. What happened was, we knew that there was a team coming to do some publicity in York. And my daughter, when she got arrested, she got banned from Bradford. Now, it's very important when God gives you a directive that you know what God has said to you. You see, because we knew that when God has sent us somewhere, he intended us for us to stay there. He intended us to go and preach there. So if Mr. Bloggs came along, the policeman, and said to us, don't preach here, we'd say, well, I'm sorry, God sent me here. Because we knew where we were meant to go. So on this occasion, my daughter didn't want to break any laws. She wanted to go into, she was going to go to York, and she said to me, Mum, she said, will you take your team, which was the Bradford team, into York? Because I'm going with your dad somewhere else, and I don't want to be in this publicity thing. And they're looking for these young ladies that were together. So I went to York, preaching, and there was 3 of us in there were more than that. There were quite a few in the teams in each place then. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because I can't remember all the detail that happened, except to say that all these arrests were leading to something. You didn't know what you were doing at the time, but they were happening. And I went into full-time ministry, and I went out during the week. And so during the week, we would be arrested in different places. Now I want to tell you this. I went into Wakefield to preach with a young lady that had a young child. And I took over the team in Wakefield because the pastor, who's now at the big church in Bradford, he couldn't no longer go out on 3 days a week. We were given 3 spaces in Wakefield by the police officer in charge there, the police constable, where we were allowed to go and preach. One was what was called the Bull Ring, which is not there anymore. One was the market, and one was by the cathedral steps. And they came out with us with cameras, and they showed us the places where we could preach. Right, those were our places. And we were allowed to be in Wakefield for an hour, 20 minutes at each place. And as soon as we went into Wakefield, they started to arrest us. When we went to the very places that they told us that we could go to. And a friend that I was with that had a young child, she didn't get arrested. Other people would preach, I would get arrested. Their preaching would be just as good as mine. It was just that God had a job for me to do. My daughter would get arrested. Another lady called Gillian Johnson, she would have got arrested. Now what happened was I got banned from Castleford, I got banned from Pontefract, I got banned from Dewsbury, I got banned from Leeds, I got banned from Bradford, I got banned from every place I went to. So what was I going to do about it? Well, I went straight back and preached. And because God had told me to. And so I got arrested, and what they did was, and they started off with my husband and my daughter, they were in a team together. They started off by doing things like saying, you're blocking the highway. Now it was very interesting that we went with a big team to Bradford. My husband and my daughter were blocking the highway, but the rest of us weren't. So when they got arrested, we just carried on preaching, and we just preached freely. Darley Street. And amazing things happened. You know, when we went to our first court appearance in Bradford, there was a fine given. I don't know what the fine was, but a little man who belongs to a church in Leeds came up to us and gave us some money in our hand. And when I was preaching in Bradford, when my daughter moved on someone else, he said, here's the money for the fine. And we had the fine. What happened then was a policeman from Halifax, a solicitor from Halifax, who works for Finn Gledhill, called Malcolm Nowell. He came out of the blue and he offered his services to us. He said, if you have any legal things that go to court, I want to represent you, and I'm not going to charge you. So he came out of the blue to represent us in court. Now, we were arrested, as I said, in numerous places. We were charged with blocking the highway. That was the only thing that struck, because in fact, in essence, in reality, if you stopped to look at a shop window, you could be arrested for blocking the highway. It's as simple as that. So it's a very hard thing to fight against. Then we got arrested for breach of the peace, for causing harassment, distress and alarm, for obstructing a police officer in the execution of his duty being to get us off the street and not allow us to preach, which was unlawful. So we just, and they would change the charge. So what happened was, in 1996, I think it was, we were in York preaching, and we were being hounded in York. And in fact, a police constable called PC Bolton arrested me and took me to the York police station, and he asked me if I would agree to sign the bylaws of York City Council. And I said, no, I won't sign these bylaws, for the very, very reason that A, we're out preaching and we've not got any amplification. So if we haven't got any amplification, we don't need to have a bylaw, because we're just using the word of our mouth. We're not singing or anything. So we had no reason to need to have signed the bylaws, because we were perfectly entitled to do what we were doing. It was our right. And then a day came when my daughter went out and said, people of York, and she got arrested as soon as she opened her mouth. And the police officer said, are you going to preach? We said, yes, of course we're going to preach. So we all got taken into the police. I was arrested 51 times. And we went into the police cell. And what happened was, when we came out after the weekend had passed, and I want to tell you, there were all sorts of funny things happened while we were there. I mean, my husband used to park his car in the car park at the police station, because he thought, well, if I'm going to get arrested, I might as well be able to get to my car when I come out. And we would take with us something to eat and a book to read and something else. And we got arrested, we'd have stuff taken ourselves. So it was all a bit of a joke, really. So anyway, they let us out on this Monday morning. We appeared before the magistrates, and the magistrates said, you're not to preach in York. And we thought, we've had enough. We've been pushed around and pushed around and pushed around. We went straight back and preached again. And we got arrested and put in the cells. And that case, we then got sent to Newhall Prison for a week. We were all women. And during that week, after a week in Newhall Prison, we got let out. Police dropped their charges. So then we carried on and I went to Wakefield. As I said, we were given permission to preach in Wakefield. And we were then arrested in Wakefield. And we were arrested on numerous occasions in Wakefield. And we were then sent to prison for 5 weeks. Newhall, where we spent 1 week in Lower Newton, and 4 more weeks in Wakefield, Newhall. And then we came out and they dropped the charges, because if we'd have done an offence, we wouldn't have had to be in there any longer length of time than what we'd already served. So they had to let us out. But they dropped the charges. And what happened eventually was that a case went before it. We were arrested so many times in Wakefield that it was difficult for them to hear our court case, because they have to have people that are unbiased, and they were running out of people that could hear our cases. So, and the Crown Prosecution officer in Wakefield absolutely hated us. He absolutely hated us. Anyway, they brought this charge against us in Wakefield, and we lost it. We lost the case. And so we took it to the Leeds Crown Court. And we lost it there too. And it was a bit of nonsense, because the judge, we were quite innocent of the wiles of the enemy in these sort of procedures. We weren't people that knew a lot about these things. We just went along with the flow. And funnily enough, when I was in the when we got sent to Leeds court, my daughter got representation because she was a one-parent family. but my friend Gillian and myself couldn't get legal representation because our husbands worked. My friend was I've got an unsaved husband, so we couldn't get any legal representation. So the judge that took my daughter's case, or not the judge, the solicitor, the barrister, he said to us, "Don't expect to get justice out of this system." And at that time we thought, we're going to get justice, everything will be done, honky-dory. It doesn't happen that way. Anyway, he represented my daughter, and during the proceedings in the court case, the judge called me out onto the stand, and he said to me, what was I preaching about? And he was trying to draw me to make out I was attacking homosexuals. And yes, we say that homosexuality is a sin. Yes, it's because it is. And we want to see people set free. But we certainly weren't targeting any member of the community that was suffering with doing anything. Anyway, in his summing up, he turned around what I said and he made us guilty. And interestingly enough, about 3 months later in the paper was a big spiel about this judge who'd been caught in a toilet misbehaving with somebody. Anyway, this case then went on to the Divisional Court in London, which was the highest court in the land. And again, my daughter took it, and the other two of us went with her because we were also on the charge papers. And what happened was we won the right. The law was ratified, and I've got a document here. You'll find it on Wikipedia. You'll find it in different places. But this was the case Redmond Bate versus the Director of Public Prosecutions. And it was a case heard before the Queen's Bench Division on the High Court regarding freedom of speech and breach of the peace. And the decision upheld the freedom to express lawful matters in a way which other people might take great exception to, that the right to free speech enshrined in Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights includes the right to be offensive, and a police officer has no right to call upon a citizen to desist from lawful conduct that others might react unlawfully does not itself render the actions of the speaker unlawful. So if other people, what would happen is, we used to get a reaction from our preaching. I have been in Darley Street when we've had firecrackers thrown at us, we've had eggs pelted at us. I've been to a dry cleaners when my jacket was full of egg yolk and I had egg yolk on my head, and I'd had to go into the toilets that used to be in Littlewoods and have my hair washed before I went home. All sorts of things happened while we were out on those streets. I've been in Wakefield when they've thrown bangers at us. I've been in Wakefield when somebody was having a fight and the police came along and arrested that person. I didn't even see it. All sorts of things have happened while we've been out on the street, positive and negative. When I was in prison, a lady came up to me and she said to me, I was leaving prison. Well, no, first of all, on the last day when I was in prison, a lady came to me and she said to me, well, why are you here? If God's on your side, why are you here? I said, I can assure you, I said, that God is not going to leave me in this prison one day longer than he wants me to be here. I'm here for a purpose. I don't know what that purpose is, but as soon as God is finished with me, I should be out of this prison. Afternoon came, and she was in the next cell. Can you get your things together? You're leaving. You know? And God knows what he's doing. And while we were in prison, I was very blessed because all sorts of things were happening in our church after we got arrested. I'm not going to say everything was good, it wasn't. Our pastor was a known man to not always treat women properly. He had an eye for women. And we did everything we could to try and keep things going. But the thing is, God has said to me, if I strike the shepherd and the sheep are scattered, what will you do with my word? And the word came to me when I was in prison. And the scripture that came to me was about David and Bathsheba. And David plotted to get Bathsheba's husband killed to cover up for his sin. When he went back to the battleground, God didn't give, and he got killed in battle because he was put in the front line of the battle. God didn't say to the troops they could leave. He told them they had a job to do, and they were to stay in the fight. And when we got bad news about what was happening in our church at that time, we felt it was right to continue with the work that God had called us to do, because it's him that calls, not man that calls. During that time, I had an Ethiopian pastor, and I felt it was right to go into full-time ministry. And he actually, I came back from working in a supermarket, which I was just doing a casual job with. And that day we'd had a conference, and he stood up the front and he said, Mrs. Bate, you should not be working, and I'm going to sponsor you. And he used to sponsor me because I used to preach in Covent Garden and Leicester Square and Brixton and Oxford Street. And so he then paid all my fares so I could go out in the mission field. And that happened after that. Now, when the court case was over in London, this is what the judgment was. Lord Justice Sedley was the legal person in London. He was trying our case. And he said, I am unable to see any lawful basis for the arrest or therefore the conviction. There was no suggestion of highway obstruction. Nobody had to stop and listen. If they did so, they were as free to express their views as the preachers should be, locked up or silenced as the appellant and her companions were to preach. In other words, they had as much right to say what they wanted to say as we had to say what we wanted to say. And Mr. Keeley for the prosecutor submitted that if there are two alternative sources of trouble, a constable can properly take steps against either. This is right, but only if both are threatening violence or behaving in a manner that might provoke violence. Now, it was interestingly that God told us right at the beginning that if ever we had any trouble, we were to go like lambs to the slaughter. And so if ever the policeman came and got us, we put up no resistance whatsoever. We just got in the van and got on with our job. Free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative, provided it does not lead to provoke violence. Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. What speakers call, and then he went on to say, from the condemnation of Socrates to the persecution of modern writers and journalists, our world has seen too many examples of state control of official ideas. And this goes on, and you can read it at your own time. He said, to proceed as the Crown Court did, from the fact that 3 women were preaching about morality, God and the Bible, the topic not only of sermons preached on every Sunday of the year, but of at least one regular daily slot on national radio, to a reasonable apprehension that violence is going to erupt, is with great respect both illiberal and illogical. What was happening was the law was being ratified and it was being changed, because at that time, if you were a Muslim and you came into this country, you were governed by laws, because you'd come in as an outsider, and so therefore there had to be laws to protect you inside the country. If you were whatever country you come from, I'm not just going to pick on Muslims, but whatever country you came from that wasn't English, Eastern European or what have you, there were laws to cover you and your best interest here. But England had always been a Christian country. And because it had always been a Christian country, nothing had been written in the statute books, because we were Christian. And everybody believed that we were Christian. But as the days get darker and darker and darker, the law needed to be ratified to give Christians the right that they should have to be able to preach the gospel. And I want to tell you now, that if you go out to preach the gospel, no policeman has the right to stop you, because you are doing a lawful act. But you may have to stand for that. I am quite convinced, and I know, because I know God, that this law has stood since 1999, I think it was, and our case was overturned in 2001, because I said my daughter took the case, so we then had to get our criminal record changed, and it took time to go through the process, so it took till 2001. I do have a criminal record still, because they never took it off, but you do have the right. You have the right to preach, and it's a given right, a God-given right. And I can honestly say from that time till this, I have looked, because I belong to the preachers. I've got a site on the web that's run by a man from Sheffield, And he puts on there, he posts on there all the preaching that's going on in the country. And I can tell you today there's preachers all over the country that go out every week. And they go out mostly unprovoked. And most of them don't know what their rights are, to be honest, they don't. So if I see anything on there for any reason, then I will write to those people and tell them that we have the right to preach. It's not about a person. It's about the call on your life. Because God gets you to the place where he wants you to be. He knows the people that will stand in those situations, and he knows the people that won't. And so therefore he uses you, he gives you, you have got the personality, and you have got within you the power of God to go through those situations and not get harassed by them. I was in prison with a lady in Newhall prison who was praising the Lord and saying Jesus was her husband and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And when news came to her that some things were happening in the church, she took to herself to pray and pray and pray and pray and pray. It wasn't the time to sit and pray and pray and pray. We were in a fight. She had a nervous breakdown when she came out of prison. Although she looked on the surface like she was but she wasn't. Underneath, she was broken up by what had gone on. You have to know what God is saying to you to do at any one time. I wasn't happy with what I was hearing, but God has spoken to me, and therefore I had to trust what he was saying. Now that church is still operating. It is changed now, and it belongs to the pastor's wife's running it. She's running it quite differently to the way Pastor ran it, because he had a prophetic anointing, and he had a deliverance ministry. And his wife is of evangelical, much more evangelical, and she has a teaching ministry. And I'm still in touch with that church. I haven't fallen away from it or anything, but I needed to go somewhere where there was more in line with what I was called to do. And though I love the people there, and I still do, I need to be in a place where God is taking people. I'm not a person that's going to sit on a pew after all I've been through. You know, my son took his life at the beginning of these things happening. And that didn't give me the right to stop either. But what it did give me is a cry in my spirit. When I saw what happened to my son, when I saw how the enemy took a young man who was really on fire for God and took his life away from him, it gave me a cry in my spirit to save any other young people that are caught up in any other scenario. And life has taught me many, many things. But I want to tell you that God has got a plan for every one of you here. You have got something that you've got to do in God's kingdom. And when you know what that is, you need to be very true to your words, because all sorts of people try and get you to do all sorts of things and burn you out. But you've got to know what God's got for you to do, because that's the only thing that you're going to be successful at. Because at the end of the day, it's him working through you. It's not the words that we say on the street. It's the spirit behind those words that draw people, not the people themselves. And once you can get into the spirit and let the spirit come forth, all manner of things will happen. And I am sure, and I'm not being negative, but I know that one day this is going to be challenged. This law is going to be challenged by somebody. You know, we've got to be strong in these days. At the moment we have this protection, so therefore we have the right. And we need to use that right while it's there for us. And, you know, God said to me through a prophecy, he said he wanted me to give the words that he gave me to speak. Whatever they were, just speak them. And he said, gave me that, in Daniel, there's a prophetic word about having feet of iron. And, you know, I experienced that in a very funny way in Covent Garden. I was preaching in Covent Garden, and the entertainers used to get really exasperated at our preaching, because they would make a way to get a crowd around them. They did it. They had a special gifting to bring this crowd around them. And as soon as we started to preach, the crowd would go from them to us. And so they were losing revenue, but we weren't gaining any revenue because we weren't out there to make money. We were just out there to bring the gospel. And so it used to make them hopping mad. And so one day, one of these entertainers got hold of my legs while I was trying to preach. And he pulled hold of my legs to try and trip me up and stop me from preaching. And I just walked along the road and he just came dragging behind me. Now, after the court case was over, we felt it was right as a church. I mean, they set up an operation in York called Operation Ranters, and they followed us around the streets and were very, condemning, really. But after these cases were over, we felt it was right to sue the police for wrongful arrest and false imprisonment. And we did. We sued the police for wrongful arrest and false imprisonment. And all the people that went out in the church and were there, all of us sued the police. And the police had to pay up about £90,000 in compensation for all the arrests that they'd made. And God told us not to take a penny, but to give it away. So we gave it all away to the third world. Now, whether it all got there or not, I don't know, but that's what we were told to do. That's what we did with it. Sometimes things happen in the body of Christ and you've got no control over them, but you have to give with the right spirit. And that's it. And so that is, I can testify that God is a good God, and I can testify to you today that you don't know what you can do. I mean, I got strip searched when I went into prison. It wasn't very nice. All manner of things happened to you. When I was in Newhall, there's two drug ladies that were supplying drugs. Because there was nobody else going for association, which is their time when you can go out and have recreation, they used to look after me. They used to come and they used to bring a board game and they used to bring a bag of sweets and I didn't set it up. I don't know why they made a beeline for me. So I prayed for people in prison. I got healed. I did things in prison because it was a testimony. Prisoners are people that they get together in groups. And they have a sense of justice. Prisoners have a sense of justice. And if you're outside of their justice, they want to know why. So having preachers in the prison, to them, was a terrible thing. And so they would, word would go around, the preachers are back. And they'd all know about it. And so, it gave us a platform to be able to minister to people later on. Hallelujah. And I do wish I'd kept in touch with those ladies, because the day I left, I didn't have a chance to see anyone. And the day we left. And so I never got a chance to follow them up. But, praise the Lord, they were used by the Lord to give a piece of bread to, a prisoner. So, God will bless them for what they did. And they were lovely. They were lovely ladies, and even though they got into wrong things. So that is my testimony of the arrest and the reason why you have the right to preach. And I have many other testimonies I could give you, but that is the one I wanted to share with you today.